All right, safety pros, welcome back for another deep dive. With us today, we're going to be tackling OSHA record keeping.
Oh, record keeping, always a fun one.
It is. It's one of those things that, can be kind of a pain point for safety professionals, but we're going to try to unpack it today and hopefully give you some really good takeaways.
Yeah, and we're focusing specifically today on those situations where you've got multiple locations or maybe you're dealing with some of those short-term projects that pop up.
Exactly. So we want to make sure that you are prepared to keep those injury and illness logs accurate, no matter how complex your company setup might be. And luckily for us, we've got some really great resources to guide us through this.
We do. We've got some information straight from OSHA's website, so you know it's official.
The source of truth.
That's right.
And we've also got a really helpful video from Safety One Source.
Yeah, that video is fantastic. It really breaks things down in a way that's easy to understand and apply. So definitely recommend checking that out.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right, so let's jump right in. One of the things that OSHA really emphasizes is the need for separate logs for each establishment. So could you walk us through the basics of that requirement?
Yeah, absolutely. So the fundamental rule here is that if you have a location that you expect to operate for a year or longer, that location needs its own OSHA 300 log.
Okay.
So we're talking about physically distinct places, separate offices, warehouses, construction sites, not just different departments within the same building.
Gotcha. So if I've got, a manufacturing facility with a separate office building, those are two distinct establishments.
Basically two separate logs.
Two separate logs. Okay.
Now you might be thinking, okay, that sounds like a lot of paperwork. What's the point?
Yeah. Why does OSHA care so much about having these separate logs?
Well, it's not just about bureaucracy. OSHA actually designed the system to be a tool that helps you improve safety.
Okay, I like that.
So think about it. Each location has its own unique hazards and risks, right? Yeah. By tracking incidents separately, you can start to pinpoint those problem areas. You can compare incident rates across your different sites, and that allows you to really target your safety efforts where they'll make the biggest impact.
That makes a lot of sense. So it's not just about compliance, it's about using this data to be proactive and make data-driven decisions about safety improvements.
You got it. It's about turning those logs into a roadmap for a safer workplace.
I love that analogy. All right.
Yeah.
So separate logs for those long-term establishments, but I know there's a bit of a break when it comes to those shorter-term projects. So can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, for sure. So if you have an establishment that's only going to be around for less than a year, OSHA gives you some options.
Okay.
You can either combine all of those short-term records onto one single log, or you can group them by division or region, whatever makes the most sense for your company.
Okay, so that's helpful for those, those construction companies that have multiple projects going on at the same time.
Exactly. Imagine you're a construction company. You've got, 3 or 4 projects, each one lasting a few months. Instead of having a separate log for each of those projects, you can just have one comprehensive record that covers all of them, much more manageable.
Oh, yeah, that's way less of a paperwork headache.
Right.
Now, one question that I get a lot from safety professionals is about whether they can keep all of these records at their headquarters. So is that even allowed by OSHA?
It is permissible, but there are some very specific conditions that you absolutely have to meet if you want to go that centralized route.
Okay, so let's break those down. What are the must-dos for companies that want to keep all their logs at headquarters?
First off, speed is key. You have to get any injury or illness information to that central location within 7 calendar days, no exceptions.
7 days, that's a pretty tight turnaround.
It is, and here's the catch. If OSHA, a former employee or their representative asks to see those records, that central location has to be able to turn around and send them to the specific establishment where the incident occurred.
So you can't just dump everything in a file cabinet at headquarters and call it a day. You need a system in place to make sure those records are accessible and can be delivered quickly.
Precisely. If you can't meet those requirements, you could be facing some pretty hefty penalties.
So you've really got to weigh the convenience of centralized record keeping against the potential logistical challenges.
Exactly. You got to make sure you've got those organizational skills honed to a fine point.
All right, safety pros, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll continue our deep dive into OSHA record keeping for multiple establishments. Stick with us. Okay, so we've talked about separate logs for, fixed locations, but what about those employees who aren't tied to just one spot? I'm thinking about like maintenance technicians who travel between facilities or salespeople who are constantly on the road. How do we handle record keeping for them?
That's a great point. With all the different work arrangements out there, it can definitely get a little bit trickier. So in these cases, the idea of a home-based establishment becomes super important.
Right.
Home base. So even if an employee works at multiple locations, we need to link them to one specific establishment for record-keeping purposes.
Exactly. And that home base is typically going to be the location where they report to their supervisor or where they receive their assignments, kind of their main point of contact.
So like if we have a maintenance technician who spends, let's say, 3 days a week at plant A and 2 days a week at plant B, where do we record an injury if something happens regardless of which plant they're at when it occurs?
You would record it on the OSHA 300 log for their home base establishment. So in your example, if the technician mainly reports to plant A or, that's where they get their tools and equipment from, then plant A would be considered their home base.
Okay, so we're really trying to create consistency in the record keeping no matter where that employee's work takes them. But what if their time is split pretty evenly between multiple locations? How do we determine that home base then? Yeah, that's where it can get a little bit grayer. You really have to look at the specific circumstances of their work arrangement. What does their job description say? Where's their main office located? Where do they receive their, tools and equipment? It requires a bit of judgment, but the goal is to have a clear, defensible rationale for why you chose a particular location as their home base.
Okay, so it sounds like we need to play detective a little bit. But once we've established that home base for an employee, we follow the same record-keeping principles that we talked about earlier.
Right, exactly. Any work-related injury or illness would be recorded on the OSHA 300 log for that designated location.
Gotcha. Now let's shift gears a little bit and talk about a situation that's becoming more and more common these days, employees who work from home. How do we figure out the home base establishment for them when their home is their workplace?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one because with remote work, the lines can get a little bit blurred. They might not have a regular physical company location that they report to. So in these cases, OSHA provides some general guidelines, but ultimately it comes down to making a reasonable determination based on the specifics of each employee's work arrangement.
Okay. So what are some of the factors that we should be considering when we're trying to figure out the home base for a remote worker?
Think about where they get their assignments from. Where is their supervisor located? Where do they primarily perform their work activities? Are they attending meetings virtually or in person?
Yeah.
It's really about looking for those anchors that connect them to a specific establishment.
So get a little bit of detective work is involved.
Exactly. We got to put those investigative skills to good use.
All right. So once we've done our due diligence and we've established that home base for our remote worker, we apply the same record-keeping principles that we've been discussing.
Absolutely. Any work-related injury or illness that happens while they're working remotely would be recorded on the OSHA 300 log for that designated home base location.
Okay, so let's say our remote employee trips over their dog while walking to their home office printer during work hours. Is that something that we would need to record?
That's a classic example, and in most cases, the answer would be yes. If it happens in their home office during work hours and while they're performing work duties, it's likely considered work-related.
Makes sense. But on the flip side, if they hurt themselves cooking dinner after they've clocked out for the day, that's probably not recordable.
Exactly. It all comes back to that core principle. Did the injury or illness occur in the course of their employment?
Right. So sometimes we really have to dig into the details to make that determination.
We do. And that's what we're here for as safety professionals. We're used to analyzing situations and gathering information to figure out what happened.
Absolutely. We're like the Sherlock Holmes of the safety world.
That's a good one. I like that.
All right. So we've covered a lot of ground here, from separate logs to travel incidents to the unique challenges of remote work. And you know what? There's even more to explore.
There is. We've only just scratched the surface of OSHA record keeping for multiple establishments.
Well, don't worry, safety pros. We're going to keep this conversation going after a quick message from our sponsors. We'll be back to wrap things up and give you some final takeaways that you can put into practice right away. So stay tuned.
And we are back, safety pros, for the final part of our OSHA record-keeping deep dive, ready to tie it all together.
You got it. Let's recap those key takeaways so you can tackle those multi-establishment scenarios like a pro.
All right, so first things first. That golden rule: separate OSHA 300 logs for each establishment that you expect to be operating for a year or longer.
Exactly. Separate locations, separate logs.
And don't forget, we're talking about physically distinct locations, not just different departments within the same building.
Right. Think separate addresses, separate logs. Gotcha. And then for those shorter-term establishments, the ones that are only going to be around for less than a year, we've got some flexibility there.
We do remember you can either combine all those records onto a single log or group them by division or region, whatever makes the most sense for your company's setup.
Right, keeps things nice and streamlined.
Yeah.
Now, what about those situations where a company wants to keep all of their logs at their headquarters? Is that something that OSHA allows?
It is allowed, but there are some very specific conditions that have to be met.
Okay, so remind us again, what are those must-dos for centralized record keeping?
Well, first and foremost, speed is key. Any injury or illness information needs to be sent to that central location within 7 calendar days, no exceptions.
7 days, that's a pretty tight turnaround time.
It is, and you also have to be able to send those records back to the specific establishment if OSHA, an employee or their representative, requests them.
Okay, so you can't just throw everything in a filing cabinet at headquarters and hope for the best.
Nope. You need a solid system in place to make sure those records are accessible and can be delivered quickly and efficiently.
So organization is key.
Absolutely. Organization is your best friend when it comes to OSHA record keeping.
Now, we also talked about those employees who might be working at multiple locations or even remotely. So how do we determine their home base establishment for record-keeping purposes?
Right. So for those folks, we really need to look at the specifics of their work arrangements. Things like where they report, where their supervisor is located, where they're getting their assignments from, where they're spending the majority of their time.
So we're putting our detective hats on again.
We're gathering all the clues to figure out where that employee's primary work location really is.
And once we've established that home base, we follow the same record-keeping principles that we discussed earlier.
Exactly. Any work-related injury or illness that occurs while they're working would be recorded on the OSHA 300 log for that designated home base location.
Makes sense. Now, I want to emphasize something that we touched on earlier. This isn't just about checking boxes for OSHA. Accurate record-keeping is a valuable tool for improving safety within your organization.
Couldn't agree more. It's like having a safety crystal ball. You know, you can analyze those records, identify trends, pinpoint those high-risk areas, and really start to develop targeted interventions to prevent future incidents.
Exactly. So we're shifting from that reactive approach to safety to a more proactive, data-driven approach.
That's the goal. We want to be ahead of the game, not constantly playing catch-up.
Absolutely. Well, this has been a fantastic deep dive into OSHA record keeping for multiple establishments. Really appreciate your insights.
My pleasure. Always happy to talk shop with fellow safety pros.
And for our listeners out there, remember, you don't have to navigate these complexities alone. There are some great resources available to help you.
Absolutely. Check out that Safety One Source video on OSHA 19030. It breaks things down in a really clear and concise way. And of course, OSHA's website is always a great resource for information.
And don't hesitate to reach out to a qualified safety professional if you have any questions or need clarification on a specific situation.
That's right. We're all in this together. Safety is a team sport.
Well said. Thanks again for joining us for this Deep Dive Safety Pros. And until next time, stay safe out there.